Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Tom Holcroft. I'm an associate in WSP London's transport planning team. I think I've been working in active travel for about 8 years, and I think that means I'm contractually obliged to also say that I grew up in the Netherlands. So I've seen the promised land, but I've been back in the UK for 16, 17 years. So and I've been working on things like LCWIPs. So I've worked on probably 13 or 14 LCWIPs at this point. So I will be going through some of my experiences. This picture is, ideally what LCWIPs should all be about: collaboration, smiling faces, sitting around a plan, and figuring out where we want to put our walking and cycling infrastructure. So agenda for my session, I'll start by talking about what an LCWIP is and why they're important. And I'll go into the 6-stage process, which is set out in the guidance. But I'm going to focus on how this is implemented on a practical level rather than just going into loads of detail about what's in the document, because different authorities do different things. So I'll go into that. I'll generally talk about the urban environment more because that's where the most potential is for converting short car trips to walking and cycling. But I'll also be talking about low traffic neighborhoods and the like, and I'll be talking about the different considerations around more rural LCWIPs too. And then I'll finish off with some top tips. I've sort of written this from the perspective of, if you've not done an LCWIP before, what do you need to know? But I'm aware that a lot of the areas you represent may have an LCWIP in place already, or maybe doing one. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But it's also worth noting a lot of authorities are now revisiting their LCWIPs. So hopefully just revisiting the process, knowing what we know after 5 years of implementing these, that should hopefully be beneficial too. So, I mean, where did it all come from? It started out in England's first cycling and walk investment strategy in 2016, where sort of these aims were made around making walking and cycling the natural choice for shorter journeys or as part of multi-stage journeys. Specific aims around doubling cycling, increasing walking, and children walking to school in particular. So then in 2020, we had the publication of Gear Change, which set out some of the how and sort of established Active Travel England, or said that Active Travel England was going to be established as part of the strategy. And then CWIS 2 has reaffirmed these aims and actually built on them a little bit. But going back to 2016, or 2017, this was accompanied by the publication of this document, the technical guidance for producing LCWIPs, which was sort of, how can local authorities produce a plan to treat walking and cycling as modes of transport in their own right and figure out what they need to do. So it's sort of very much to accompany the strategy. So the guidance is strategic. It's an evidence-based approach to identify what you need at the local level, and it includes a lot of stakeholder engagement. So LCWIPs are kind of an attempt to correct the mistakes of previous attitudes and policies regarding walking and cycling as transport modes. Previously it was maybe more seen as a leisure pursuit, and this is LCWIPs are about treating them as modes of transport. Many areas have never had a strategic plan for walking or cycling as transport before, which means that in the past, things like cycle lanes would only go on wide roads where they wouldn't bother anyone. They'd sort of start and end almost at random with not too much thought to whether it would serve any routes in any kind of meaningful way. And, just for a bit of fun, this is the kind of thing that LCWIPs and LTN 120, the new cycle infrastructure design guidance is trying to avoid. So, if anyone wants more of this kind of examples, these are all collated in Warrington Cycle Campaign's tongue-in-cheek Cycle Facility of the Month series. But yeah, it's things like this where cycle facilities just stop when there's a side road and then restart again afterwards, or stop every time there's a crossing or something, and the designer just didn't know what to do. And what we do want, the kind of thing we do want is here. So examples from strategically thought through cycle facilities from Cambridge, Manchester, and Leeds Bradford. So these link places that link people to places they actually want to go and protect them from large volumes of traffic, on links or at junctions. Obviously, this slide has a bit of a cycle focus, and we talk about active travel here. So we need to think about walking and wheeling as well. So from the walking side, I could show a picture of a new pedestrian crossing, which just opened up a new route for people to help them switch modes. That's kind of one of the high impact things you can do, is provide a crossing across a busy road to make it more convenient for someone to walk a certain route. But that would just look like a picture of pedestrian crossing. So instead, here's a picture of what something like a low traffic neighborhood can do. By removing through traffic, you can reopen streets to fulfill other purposes, such as letting children play. And here's an example from Brixton High Street in London, near where I live. So you can see before we had 3 lanes, and we had an incredibly busy pavement footway here with bus stops. But during COVID, a lane of one of those 3 lanes was reallocated to create a widened footway, and the whole area now is much more pleasant to walk through. So that's an example of high impact walking infrastructure improvements. But back to LCWIPs. So they're a long-term approach of 5 to 10 years, with the idea that you refresh the plan at regular intervals with progress. If you've built some of the infrastructure, and if you've got new housing you need to take into account, new routes to plan, etc., etc. When I originally wrote that sentence that they're non-mandatory, but local authorities with LCWIPs are best placed to make the case for future investment, that's certainly come true. And in some of the recent active travel fund allocations, it's almost obligatory. It's that you will be asked, do you have an LCWIP or a similar strategic active travel plan? The outputs of the LCWIP are network plans for walking and cycling, along with a prioritized program of the infrastructure you'd need to support that network, and then summarizing the whole methodology into a report. So the idea is that LCWIPs will help authorities to identify cycling and walking infrastructure improvements, integrate walking and cycling planning into local decision making, help ensure long-term considerations given to walking and cycling and wheeling in local planning, transport policies and strategies, and also help make the case for future infrastructure funding. And I think a lot of common misunderstandings about LCWIPs arise among people who are more familiar with more conventional car-based transport planning. And I think a handy way of getting across the key points about LCWIPs is to remind everyone what the acronym itself actually stands for. So starting with local, the real potential for LCWIPs is in replacing short car journeys. So as stated in Gear Change, 58% of car journeys in 2018 were under 5 miles, and in urban areas, more than 40% of journeys were under 2 miles. So for many people, those journeys are perfectly suited to walking and cycling in terms of the range. So from my experience, stakeholders have sometimes tried to shift the focus of LCWIPs to connecting different towns and cities on interurban links before thinking about trying to sort out those short journeys in urban areas, which is quite a car-centric way of thinking about things, thinking about connecting towns rather than sorting out the towns. And it's also not that cost-effective, and it's also possibly not quite as inclusive, as it caters more to people more willing to cycle long distances. So LCWIPs should enable more cycling within towns first, in my opinion, by providing people who don't currently cycle with the infrastructure they need to feel safe, and also enabling walking and wheeling through improved footways and crossings and so on. So that kind of leads on to my next point, which is that the cycling and walking. So the focus on LCWIPs is often on cycling because as a mode, it typically requires more infrastructure to support it. But it's also important to remember to develop meaningful plans for walking infrastructure, and remember also that cycling and walking infrastructure can often complement one another, e.g. through low traffic neighborhood style interventions, which make streets more comfortable to cycle on, but also easier to cross, and things like combined crossings over busy roads and other barriers. And then finally, infrastructure plans. So LCWIPs are supposed to contain specific plans for infrastructure, even if they're very, very high level. So the LCWIP process wasn't designed to just produce lines on a map with no thought to what infrastructure is actually needed to bring about modal shift. So if you actually include high-level conceptual details for infrastructure in LCWIPs, that will allow schemes to quickly be appraised and developed through to the feasibility stage when new funding or additional resources suddenly become available. But not every authority has chosen to go into the infrastructure side on their LCWIP, so I'll talk about that more a little bit later. So going into the 6-stage process now. So stage 1 is typically quite a short stage. It's where you decide the governance of the LCWIP and also its geographical extent. This can be done in a number of ways. I've seen some authorities make the LCWIP the district, which might include 2 or 3 towns, as well as rural areas between them. This can be difficult. Well, this can bring with it some challenges, such as you want to focus on the urban areas. As I said, that's where the most potential for converting short trips to walking and cycling is, because of the population density and the distances involved. But politically, it can often be difficult because some of the other villages maybe will be saying, "Oh, why don't we have something in this plan?" Typically, if you're going out and auditing as part of the LCWIP, you'll be limited by resources, so you'll have to pick where you go and audit, and you'll typically start with the towns, and then that can lead the villages to feel left behind. So another approach that I've seen is where an LCWIP is just for an urban area, so just for one town, even if politically that sits within a wider district. And then the idea being that the rest of the district will be covered in a future LCWIP, which might approach things slightly differently. So that's one kind of thing you need to think about at the determining scope stage. You'll also at that stage create your joint working group, which I typically work with the sort of where you have a county council that's the highways authority, and then a district council. So it's kind of the joint working group would have representatives, both of those on it. But that would be different in a combined authority. So this is just something to figure out on a case-by-case basis. And of course, you also need to think about neighboring areas. Do they have LCWIPs? Do you want an officer from a neighboring area to be on your board, or to be a key stakeholder, and so on? So moving into stage 2, this is all about figuring out what information and data you can use in your evidence base. So one aspect of that is more policy focused, i.e. figuring out if there's any relevant previous work, such as cycling action plans or anything that can be built on. The LCWIP process was designed to be flexible so that authorities didn't need to start from scratch if there was useful previous work. But either way, the main point of this stage is to figure out your walking and cycling desire lines, and therefore where you need to plan routes and add infrastructure in the later stages. So the information you gather in stage 2 will depend somewhat on the approach to network planning being taken, which is stages 3 and 4. So there's 2 main approaches to this, which I've seen, which is route-based network planning and area-based network planning. Ideally, you should do a bit of both. The original guidance focuses heavily on the route-based bit of network planning, but area-based network planning is very useful, and it's become a lot more prominent since the guidance was published, which is actually largely thanks to Brian. I don't know if he's on the call yet, but if he does come on, he might want to touch on that. So route-based planning is where you take your origins and destinations and you think about the desire lines between them and try and plot it out on a network. So that can be done manually, by getting all of your key stakeholders in a room and plotting your key origins and destinations and linking things together on the network. Another approach is to use a model, such as the freely available Propensity to Cycle tool, which is based on Census 2011 data in terms of where people lived, worked, and went to school. So that obviously has to be taken with a pinch of salt because it's only considers trips to work and trips to schools, and it doesn't take into account new housing built since 2011 or new housing planned for the future. So we at WSP, for example, we built our own model, which is customizable and allows these other factors to be taken into account so that you can think about trips to the shops as well. That's where a lot of the potential is for things like walking and cycling. And it's also worth saying you can gather data from sources like Strava or Widen My Path. But again, you have to take every source of data with a pinch of salt. So you can also combine these two approaches. So one thing we've done is do a bit of modeling and then present that in a workshop along with the key origins and destinations and say, does this look right? Do you think we've captured all of the places that need linking? But it's also very useful to think about areas. So this is best done manually by, again, just getting everyone around on a big plan with markers. And the usual process is to identify your barriers. So things like busy roads, rivers, rail lines, things that are hard to cross or unpleasant or dangerous to walk and cycle on. And what that does is it splits an area up into cells. So the idea being that within that cell, it's slightly, more pleasant to walk and cycle. But just to kind of ensure that, you can then think about filtering traffic within those cells, so making sure that there's not huge through traffic problems, and also connecting the cells with one another. So if you've got two areas next to each other which are fairly okay, but there's a barrier dividing them, and then you provide a new crossing, you can kind of potentially double the amount of area that someone might feel comfortable walking and cycling in. So that in itself creates routes. And another benefit of thinking about things in that way is that crossings and filters are a lot cheaper than curb protected cycle tracks, for example. Of course, you need a bit of both, but things like crossings and filters can be very good quick wins, for example. So going back to the whole, if you've already got an LCWIP and you're talking with the people who are going to revisit it, maybe they didn't take such an area-based approach when they first did it, and maybe that's something to revisit if they're doing take two of the LCWIP. So yeah, just to sort of finish off this bit about area-based network planning, this kind of the color coding here is to sort of show that this cell here is what we call more permeable, because these little G circles are crossings or gateways. So the idea being where you can come into this area here and you can feel safe within it, and then you can leave it there. Whereas some of these other areas are not as accessible in terms of not having the crossings to them. So it's also useful at this stage to see what info you have on existing walking and cycling facilities. So on some LCWIPs, I've been able to get GIS files which showed the locations of all shared footways and advisory cycle lanes, which is useful because you can then map them alongside the emerging desire lines to see where there's overlaps and potential for tie-in. It's also often quick and easy to upgrade existing substandard facilities than it is to create new ones from scratch. So obviously you need to do both, but that's a potential way of getting some quick wins into your plan as well. So that's a bit of transport planning 101. I've jumped the gun a bit because that's kind of what stages 3 and 4 are, that the network planning for cycling and walking, which usually happen in parallel. But one additional point I haven't covered is that the guidance says that for network planning for walking, you also want to think about core walking zones, like areas where there's lots of destinations close together, and then focus on the key walking routes to those. That's all fine and can be done manually very quickly, but generally speaking, the techniques I mentioned on the last page either account for walking to, or they can easily be adapted to do so. So the other aspect to stages 3 and 4 is that once you've identified your routes and your areas, you need to determine the improvements required. So There are 2 audit tools released as part of the guidance to help do this. The route selection tool for cycling and the walking route audit tool for walking. But to be honest, they aren't the best tools, and there are other tools that you can use. The guidance is quite flexible about that. And Active Travel England, in fact, are releasing a new set of tools, so something to watch out for. But for now, I just sort of emphasize that whatever tools you do use, the important thing is to make sure, if you can, that those assessing the routes and determining the infrastructure improvements required should ideally be knowledgeable and experienced in active travel and the latest guidance. It's also worth saying that not every authority chose to audit routes in their first LCWIPs. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but it can make sense for certain authorities depending on the way their highways departments are set up. Just exercise caution, because active travel isn't business as usual, and many highways teams might tend towards sort of conservative, low impact interpretations of the guidance if they've spent their careers mainly designing for car traffic. By the time you come on to stage 5, you should have your full list of infrastructure improvements, and the next job is to put them in some sort of prioritized order. So again, the guidance is quite flexible about this, but it suggests creating a spreadsheet where you score each piece of infrastructure or each route against a series of criteria to see which comes out on top. So you might want to see you score each route in terms of its deliverability, its location in relation to housing or key employment areas. Some authorities have even used indices of multiple deprivation to help prioritize routes in deprived areas. And I think I heard of one authority using obesity rates as well to sort of take that into account when prioritizing routes. And it might also help to think about costs at this stage. So value for money might be something that feeds into the prioritization process. The guidance does have some example costs for infrastructure, but it's a bit out of date now. And again, some authorities go into a lot of detail here, sort of costing up every single piece of infrastructure, and other authorities just take their routes, take the length of them, and use a per kilometer approximation to figure out cost. And stage 6 is about integrating the outputs of the LCWIP into local planning and policy, infrastructure delivery plans, and so on. And an LCWIP really should bring together any previous plans or programs of infrastructure and sort of supersede anything which there isn't good evidence for or is substandard in terms of current best practice. So if you've reached that stage, then you're then in a position to show the DFT and Active Travel England that you've thought about where walking and cycling improvements need to go in your area, and that should help win the funding you need to deliver the change. You might have noticed I haven't mentioned stakeholder engagement yet. So the guidance isn't too prescriptive about when or how often stakeholder engagement needs to take place, but I'm going to talk you through the most common times when stakeholder engagement does take place during an LCWIP and why. So firstly, I've simplified the 6-stage process into this little flow chart, just gathering the information, identify patterns, develop a draft network, audit the routes, identify the improvements, and then you have your final plans along with that list of infrastructure. So one thing you can do is right at the start, give your stakeholders a blank map and say, what are the issues and opportunities as you see them for active travel in your area? And then that can be a very useful guide when you're developing those draft cycling networks. So that's one thing you can do. You could also develop your draft walking and cycling network and then show it to stakeholders. Say, does this look right? Have we missed anything? Do we need to add in some new connections? Another opportunity might be when you've been out, audited routes. Routes typically will change a little bit during that process because you might find that you can't deliver something on a particular corridor and you need to find an alternative route. So that's a point where you could go back to stakeholders and say, this is what we think is needed in terms of infrastructure as well. And then another one is at the end of the whole process where you sort of do a full formal consultation on the completed LCWIP, which might be the summary report, for example. So you can do engagement in a number of ways. We used to do a lot more in-person sessions. There's also the opportunity of using tools like Miro, where you've got sort of a whiteboard and you can get people to leave comments on plans. And there's even more advanced tools in a way, so things like Commonplace, which enable really wide consultation to take place, but that costs a bit more money to set up, but it can be a sort of comprehensive way of doing things. And in one example, we did this this Commonplace consultation. It just showed us how much demand there was for active travel improvements, which was really useful as we then went on to develop the LCWIP. I want to come back again to low traffic neighborhoods. I sort of touched on them before when I was talking about area-based planning. But the area-based approach often centers around what we call low traffic neighborhoods, and sometimes you hear them under different names. But I've created some infographics here to help illustrate how the route-based and the area-based network planning can complement one another. So how low traffic neighborhoods can sit alongside strategic corridor routes. So yeah, if you've got your strategic routes for cycle traffic in an area, you've got your core walking zone and your walking routes to that. Then between those kind of strategic areas, you might be able to identify some low traffic neighborhoods. You might want to restrict motorized through traffic on those to enable door-to-door journeys by cycling and walking. That's sort of enabled by adding a few modal filters in strategic locations to create those quiet areas, and then connecting them across the busy roads with those simple crossings. And that quickly expands the number of cyclable streets. I've sort of said this before, so it is cheaper and easier and quicker to do that, but it does require comprehensive stakeholder engagement. That's something that we've all, I think, learned in the last 2 or 3 years. I think I'm a little bit behind, so I'll just rush through these to the rural slide. So there's a lot of considerations when you're doing rural LCWIPs. There's a lot of challenges, the greater distances, the kind of lack of different routes to take, land ownership, nature reserves, narrow roads without footways, topography, even things like flooding and visibility issues. But some of the main ones actually is kind of around that it being harder to make the case for long-term investment because of the lower levels of usage. But flipping this on its head, and sort of we did a session internally within WSP, having worked on quite a few rural LCWIPs, where we generated this list of challenges that we've come across when working on the rural side. We also kind of touched on, we had a chat within ourselves around how to apply the guidance in the context. So what lessons were learned. So I'll go through these. So trying to get a basic provision for walking where you don't have a footway on a rural road. Actually, I kind of experienced this firsthand a couple of weeks ago. I cycled to Brighton with some friends, and we were on quite a busy, fast road. We were on busy, fast roads for quite a lot of the time. But whenever there was a footway, that enabled the less confident cyclist to just hop onto the footway, let traffic pass, and then carry on again. But where there wasn't that option, it was quite stressful and uncomfortable and unpleasant, and probably unsafe as well. So that's just an example of, that could be one of the first things you do, because it will possibly benefit cyclists as well. A lot of the focus tends to be around, in rural areas, around upgrading existing off-road paths and public rights of way to allow cycling. The issues with that is that it might require surfacing, and that might cause issues with equestrian users, for example. There are things you can do. There's things like Flexipave, which is a type of material which is sort of surfaced, doesn't cause so many issues among equestrian users, or you can provide sort of parallel facilities. The other things you can do: tighten up junction geometry, removing access barriers, such as sort of stiles. And then also it's important to sort of note that in the recent guidance, shared use footways are sort of quite frowned upon, but that's mostly in urban areas. in rural areas, shared use footways can be okay in the right context. So, you know, as long as it's not right next to a really fast road with no buffer between it, and it's sufficiently wide, those are the kinds of things you need to think about, but they can be appropriate in the rural context. And you can also have these things designated as cycle tracks, which pedestrians may lawfully use. There's also modal filters is a good way of focusing things. So there's an example here of a sort of semi-rural modal filter, which I came across, which is a quite pleasant route to walk and cycle down. There's a few other things there, visual narrowing, signage, lowering speed limits and design speeds can be quite hard to do, but it's worthwhile if you can do that. Making sure you do a lot of engagement, especially with the different types of users that you get in the rural environment. So British Horse Society, preservation groups, etc. You get there are a lot of good examples of rural walking and cycling facilities. So Cambridgeshire's greenways, parts of the National Cycle Network. And it's also, you know, going back to some of the difficulties around long distances and topography. E-bikes, can e-bikes be supported through policy somehow, etc. And yeah, rural cycling can be absolutely lovely, whether for utility trips or leisure trips. It's just, you know, it's important to remember that. It's important to remember that the attractiveness of such routes is often high simply because it's nice to be out in the countryside. So I'll just finish up with some tips here. So adapt the LCWIP process to suit your own needs, but be bold with a dash of realism. So there's a lot of caveats there, but that's kind of the guidance is flexible, but you should still try and be bold with a focus on what you can actually achieve in your area. LCWIPs are sort of only the starting point, and if they are bold, they'll do things like reallocate road space and restrict through traffic on quiet streets, and that will increase your walking and cycling levels, but it is challenging. And actually, often I've worked with authorities where they've done quite a bold LCWIP without ever trying anything simple like trying to implement a school street or a modal filter. So why not try that first, or why not try that while developing an LCWIP, just to sort of get some experience of that and understand the political appetite. Sort of relating to that, engage. That's a major tip. Sort of do as much as you can. I gave some opportunities within the process for engagement. You could do all of those. You could do 2 or 3 sort of periods of stakeholder engagement, and that will help. Using the wide-reaching tools like Commonplace to show the level of support available. Make sure your LCWIPs are aligned with LTN 120 and gear change. So that's the latest cycle infrastructure design guidance. Also should say, make sure it aligns with inclusive mobility as well, a more recent document. Include low traffic neighborhoods in your LCWIPs if you can, and include high-level plans for infrastructure to be developed. So that can help fast mobilization when funding becomes available. And also just, one final point, just to remember to be inclusive. We need to provide infrastructure for all ages and abilities. So that's the end of my presentation. Simon, hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. If you'd like to stop sharing briefly.
Yeah.
Lovely. A really comprehensive overview. Thank you. And I think there will be clearly, significant variation across the network in terms of our experience and connections with LCWIP development as it's progressing in our local areas. I think we can clearly guarantee that as a result of the work that Active Travel England are doing, that the LCWIP process is at the forefront of how walking, cycling and wheeling will be strategically planned longer term. So your overview has been really helpful. Please, for all the listeners today, please continue to think about the questions that you may have related to your experience in active partnerships or related to your engagement and participation with local authority, and how and how that relates. So Tom, we'll take questions towards the end when we run the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're going to move on. So I don't believe Brian has been able to join us. However, I will share Brian Deegan, that is from Active Travel England. I will share in the chat a link to Danny Williams and Chris Boardman currently presenting to the Transport Committee on the effectively the work of Active Travel England. So it's an overview of the organisation and you know their action plans as they stand at the minute in the short term. So I'll pop that in the chat during the next presentation, and that's something that you can listen to in your free time, and that will probably give a supplement the topic and content that Brian Deegan would have covered with us. So I'd like to move on to John Chapman, who is Commercial Director of nGenius.ai. John has worked with the company since its inception in 2020, and they're local to me. They're based in Norwich. nGenius.ai is a cutting-edge artificial intelligence tool, which uses existing CCTV hardware and provides some of the most advanced traffic and active travel monitoring data possible. So John has considerable experience leading the strategic business development of innovative technologies, and has been completely focused on the work with nGenius.ai for the last 2 years. So John, welcome today. I hope you will be able to share screen. And
yeah, hi Simon, thanks for that introduction. Let me have a go. As always, there's the panic when I remember how to use Teams rather than, sorry, there you go, Zoom rather than Teams or whatever else. Can you guys see that?
yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, thank you for that introduction, Simon. What I will try to do today is focus less on any kind of business development experience I have, and really more focus on what we think the potential is for you know, how AI and kind of more advanced solutions can start to feed into the things that Tom was talking about there. So it's almost as though the talk was planned, but really what we've got will feed into a lot of the themes there that were mentioned by Tom specifically there in phase 2, and kind of talking around understanding how people are actually using the infrastructure that's in place, and that's really what we're designed to do. So what I'll do is I'll jump through the presentation. There's kind of a lot to go through in theory around capabilities in this space. This is kind of not designed to be a full overview of everything that this technology or even specific solution can do. It's really just to kind of introduce the concept. So more than happy to take questions as part of the panel. But so without going into this too much, as I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, at least I hope so, there's a huge active travel opportunity in order to kind of help improve carbon emissions, improves health, reduce congestions in our urban areas, and the benefits that can be gained from just getting a few more people walking and cycling has been proved time and time again to be much more significant than kind of a lot of the other small changes that can be made. So that's why, again, as I'm sure you guys appreciate, there's this real focus across a lot of the authorities that we speak to kind of start looking at how active travel can be put on equal footing, at least with vehicle travel, again, as one of the themes that Tom had mentioned. And so one of the things that we think can help to make this shift is data. So it's rare that you'd be on a Zoom call these days without data being mentioned, but again, one of the things that has come out of numerous studies, we've got a quote here from the Horizon 2020 Flow project, which looks at 6 capital cities across Europe and talked about how walking and cycling could be improved. One of the key findings was that there just isn't the information on those kind of modes of transport that you have on vehicles. So making those decisions, making the planning, putting in infrastructure that will really work and make an effect is much harder because that information just isn't there. It's not as easy to gather. We'll discuss why in a second. These findings are really mirrored in the gear change report as well, and that's something that we've kind of looked at a lot. Is it's not just about understanding numbers with walking and cycling a lot of the time, because of the way that people interact with that type of infrastructure, it's much more complex, and there's a need for qualitative data as well as quantitative. So not just how many people walked here, not just how many people cycled here, but okay, well, did they use the dedicated cycle infrastructure, or were they on the road lanes? These are the kind of questions that will come up quite quickly, as I'm sure you guys appreciate when you're starting to look into that data of usage. So as I mentioned, the problem though that you have when capturing this data is really inherent in active travel. So the data is far more complex. With vehicles, a lot of the time what you're capturing is vehicles movement on a road. Those roads are defined, and therefore the paths of movement of vehicles are pretty defined, and you can model them pretty accurately because you generally know how they're going to move. With active travel, with pedestrians, cyclists, e-scooters, whatever it may be, that data is far more complex, far more variable in terms of how they move, the types of paths that they will take, the way they cut across the roads. All this kind of thing is just much harder to quantify or guess at because those paths just aren't as defined. And that means that the way to capture this data at the moment is highly manual. So for the majority of the way, when people are kind of looking to input schemes, to kind of get that micro level data of how people really interact with a new junction, what is still being done 96% of the time is having someone sit there and watch video footage of that junction for 12 hours and kind of manually note down where people walk, are they on the pavement, when they cross, and kind of doing that process highly manually, which obviously is kind of very cost effective and just doesn't give you the same types of information that you're able to get through using artificial intelligence, which is where we come in. So as I mentioned here, I won't delay on this too much, but the only real way to get any kind of information on active travel at the moment is manually. And even then, it's kind of limited in what people can do. It's far less accurate, inefficient, and slow because of that high variability of the data. The existing other solutions that are out there really just are not designed to capture active travel. They're based on magnetic induction, the weight of vehicles, loops in the road, and LiDAR, things like that are really focused again on kind of capturing large vehicles and being able to distinguish between a cyclist or motorcycle, a pedestrian or an e-scooter is just not what they're designed for, and it's very difficult to get that kind of granularity that you need when thinking about these complex schemes. And this is where we come in. So what we have developed is a solution that ingests video that's captured from any camera. So whether it be a temporary survey camera, a 4G camera that's out on the network, or existing CCTV, we ingest that footage and we run machine learning, artificial intelligence, machine vision in the cloud, which analyzes the footage and identifies a number of objects and how they move within the scene, and then present that data back through an online dashboard, which we can go into a little bit, but not too much today, but really to kind of give an idea of not just how vehicles move, but really what the types of movement and active travel is doing in that space as well. The idea here really is that this is a highly repetitive, highly manual process at the moment that's being run through video. All that process already exists, and there's a huge opportunity for us, other providers, AI in general, to take that kind of highly repetitive task and really make it efficient and improve better data for the same or lower cost. And this is really one of the spaces where obviously there's lots of talk about AI, machine vision in particular, what the applications could be and how it's going to change the world. And really, it starts in the place of what are the kind of mundane, repeatable tasks. And so this is really what this is designed for. And so as we move on, the kind of data that we can collect, it is really vast. So the basic principle here is that if a human could recognize something from an image, then the system or an AI system can be trained to do so as well, because they're actually taught by humans, kind of pointing things out to them. We rerun the training. And the idea is if you can identify it, the system will be able to as well. But on top of that, we're actually able to geolocate everything that we look at as well. So we will take some footage from a camera. All we need to know is kind of where that camera was placed. And then once we process the footage, we'll actually be able to give longitude, latitude coordinates to every single object that we track. always stop there and say that track is probably the wrong word, but there's not really a better one for it at the moment. All the footage that we process, we downgrade dramatically so that all license plates faces are blurred at source. We don't output anything that's PII, we only output kind of statistical information. We also only track things as long as it's in the scene to give you an idea of those desire lines, how it moves through. But really, because we're using vision, because we're using AI, it's not just about counting things anymore. You can start to look at, yes, we have 44 different classifications of vehicle or object. That's from some varying types of pedestrian all the way up to different types of articulated lorry that are kind of out there on the roads. But we can also start to look at things much more contextually. So what are their speeds? Because we know where they are, we can see how fast they cross across a particular zone. We can look at the counts by lane, what usage do pedestrians actually have at this crossing, where do they stop, where do they go, what are their desire lines and heat maps for the different users and classes, down to a really, really low level of accuracy, so high level of accuracy. And so we're really starting to look at the things like, do cyclists use the actual road infrastructure here, or do they use the dedicated infrastructure? And so what we're saying here is that there's a real opportunity for these types of systems to give much better data using the systems that are kind of already out there. So the way that we work, or the way that the systems work generally, there's kind of two types of model. You can do it via an automated survey. This would be a temporary camera or just downloading some footage from a camera that you already have. You would then go onto the tool, just upload it directly, select the type of analysis that you want, press go, and then the insights are there for you the next day, process in kind of 5x real time. So you're not only getting better data at lower cost, but much more quickly as well. And the idea there is that you just use the footage from the cameras that you have, and will kind of output the data that you need. Or there's an alternative option here that says you can connect to CCTV cameras 24/7, and then you're able to actually stream that data live real time. So you can see those anonymized statistical outputs of queue lengths at a junction, where cyclists have a high propensity at different times of day, and you can start to see that data 24/7 in real time. But again, the key message here really is anywhere where you've got cameras, you can start to get this much, much richer data that we'll talk about shortly. So that's an overview of the kind of solution and the kind of the opportunity that's out there. The problem with how it's captured at the moment. What I wanted to do next was just kind of talk a little bit more about a case study. So somewhere where we've used this, where it's delivered value. Really, the idea here is that this solution is used to enhance those surveying efforts that are kind of being run at the moment to pre and post scheme. So, where do we need to put in infrastructure? Where do people actually want to walk? How can we affect this? And then also proving the effectiveness of that scheme for the Department for Transport as well. Again, as the gear change report mentions, there's a need for more and more of that qualitative data that says, let's not just put in a cycle lane somewhere, let's make sure that it's going to be used and kind of understand what those different data points can be. So the case study we're going to talk about, as Simon mentioned here, is really a review of cycling in Norwich city centre. The context here is that the Norfolk County Council were awarded £32 million from the Transforming Cities Fund, probably about 18 months to maybe 2 years ago now. And really the focus of that is to improve walking and cycling infrastructure in Norwich as kind of well as some bus infrastructure as well. The ambition really in the long term is just to make walking and cycling the preferred mode of transport for both leisure and commuting in the city and in wider Norfolk. And there's a lot of schemes that are kind of being run there simultaneously. These large programs really require a lot of data constantly to kind of do these stage implementations of schemes. The scheme we're kind of look at for this case study is focused on Grapes Hill, which is a key route just into Norwich city centre. Really, it's a large roundabout. Obviously, it was designed specifically really with vehicles in mind, but over recent times, as it's a key route into the city through a kind of a park that's just on the right-hand side there as well, it's something that's been focused on for improving for walking and cycling. So the new scheme aims to rebalance that prioritisation through widening the pathways, making them shared use for cyclists and pedestrians, as well as putting in dedicated crossings with kind of signalized lights for both pedestrians and cyclists segregated out, so that each travel mode has its own different way of getting across this roundabout. One thing I would mention, there's a guy called Alex Cliff who works at Norfolk County Council, who's the Transport Network and Innovation Manager, who's kind of in charge of a lot of these schemes. This is just one of many of the schemes they're doing. If anyone's kind of interested in some of the things that Norfolk are looking to do with over the next couple of years, there's some really interesting bits and pieces they're doing around kind of Dutch style roundabouts in Norfolk that will be coming up over the year or two as well. So if anyone did want to speak directly with the council about it, I know he's always willing to kind of talk to more people about ideas and how to get people walking and cycling. But specifically, this kind of this case study is focused on the crossing that's on the right-hand side down there at the bottom, where they'd put in a new dedicated cycle and walking crossing to kind of segregate out. The problem that they were finding is once that infrastructure got put in, they were unsure as to how effective it was for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, whenever you widen paths or when you put in dedicated pedestrians and cyclist infrastructure, it has to be at the expense of space on the road. And so for a lot of these schemes, a lot of the changes here, the lanes for vehicles are actually becoming narrower. And that wasn't just a problem for vehicle users in this case. There were some cycling groups who were actually the kind of keener cyclists who preferred to go faster were saying, well, actually what you're doing is reducing space on the road for us as well. So you're making it less safe for the cyclists who actually use us here, meaning we're on narrower roads with the same size vehicles, and that's been put in for leisure cyclists who don't really cycle here anyway. And so there was kind of this qualitative data that was needed to understand, well, how has this infrastructure actually impacted the different types of cyclists? How has this infrastructure actually impacted overall cycling here? Because, we don't just have opposition from road users. Opposition is probably strong, but kind of comments from cycling groups as well as kind of others, which obviously is not what you want when you put in dedicated cycle infrastructure. So what we did with them, this is kind of a screenshot from one of the cameras that they already had in place there. What you can see is the dedicated infrastructure over here. So these pictures probably aren't the best for the detail that you could look, but there's kind of dedicated cycle crossing here, pedestrians infrastructure there as well. And these are the roundabout lanes. So what we did with them was we uploaded some footage from this camera looking just over 8 hours. We drew these 2 count lines on the screen. This is how we do all our counts. We kind of draw these lines for when we're interested in seeing the actual usage. And what we were looking at here is, this is obviously a one-way, but this is bi-directional. To see cyclists using this infrastructure, people traveling in this space in Norwich, who was using the dedicated cycle infrastructure and who was using the roundabout lanes to go round the roundabout. And this is all for the kind of westbound cycle traffic. So we drew those 2 gates on there, and then we've also drawn a heat map zone. So what we're saying is anything within that zone, we're interested in how it moves, not just kind of the count of it, but what it really looks like in terms of its movement, and that'll make a little bit more sense as we go on. So we uploaded that footage, we drew those gates on, selected it, and then obviously we presented that data back to them so that they could see the results through the system, and we'll kind of go through what that looked like now. So what we found was, obviously using the 2 gates, as you can see there, drawn on Ordnance Survey, we were able to kind of show them the actual full breakdown of cycle usage in both directions on both gates. Obviously this is kind of one-way gate because it's looking at vehicle usage. It's vehicle lanes on a roundabout, so it's what kind of only one-way traffic. And we had the full breakdown there of all the different types of traffic that you can use. We break it up into super groups here, or spool it up rather than show 44 different classes. And I was actually asked us to see all those at once just yet.
Sorry,
so you can see the comparison.
John, just to let you know, your screen has stopped sharing.
I did wonder if it had. So give me 2 seconds.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Simon. Perfect. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Brilliant. So what you're seeing here is kind of the 3 super groups of overall usage. This is actually quite a good site here for pedestrian usage in general versus vehicular, because it's a specific pedestrian crossing. And we're looking at the different overall usage of the scheme. And what we're comparing here on those arrows is the cycle usage. So when we actually ran the survey, what we saw was, I think it's 89% overall of the cyclists were using the dedicated infrastructure, whereas only 11% were using those road lanes. With that 89%, we can then break down so that you can compare only westbound traffic, so that you can be even kind of clearer on, for people who are traveling west on those lanes, It's still 31% to 11%, so 3 times the number are using that dedicated infrastructure that's been put in coming through the park. And so really you could see there that its usage was much more focused on the more general cycle usage, and it's been a really effective scheme that said, well, actually, look, we have to accommodate to that those people who are kind of going to use it most. So these were really great results for Norfolk, kind of showing that the real detail of how people were using it, not just an overall number for cyclists coming through this area, but getting much more context on, was it the dedicated infrastructure that was doing that, or was it the kind of just general usage? Further to that, and kind of going into a little bit more detail, apologies, let me just move through here. What we also did was show them that heat map. And kind of this where it became a little bit more, a lot more interesting for them as well. So what you're seeing here is how cyclists actually move through this space in kind of the general area. And you can see, again, obviously, immediately what you see is that the vast majority of cyclists are using that crossing point. This is a traveling heat map, so you don't get measured on this whilst you're traveling rather than whilst you're stopped. And so there's a very quick and easy way to very visually say, look, very obviously, the majority of people are using the dedicated infrastructure rather than the lanes. But what it also allowed us to show was, what you can see here is the arrows that say unchanged in the new scheme. On the left there, you've got a pedestrian path that hadn't been widened, had not been changed as part of the scheme. And what we learned by showing them the heat map was that even on that place where it wasn't changed, you can see that there are more cyclists than there are on the road because of that heat map that you've got. So it was kind of further backed up that point that said, well, we need to make even further changes here, because the desire to cycle on the pavement here is much stronger than that of the desire to spot cycle on the lanes, because it's just not safe. It's a big roundabout. There's lots of vehicles coming through here. And so the anecdotal evidence wasn't just kind of disproved, it was really kind of shown to be opposite, that even where the scheme hadn't been changed, people were preferring to use the pedestrian infrastructure, which kind of implies that there's need for further change here. So really they got a lot of insight out of looking at it this way. And this is all data that was generated by just reviewing 8 hours of footage that they kind of already had on a camera. They sent it to us, we did a little bit of calibration, and then this is real world footage and kind of real world data for how people move through this space whilst cycling. So this is dedicated specifically on cycling. You can look at this for kind of vehicles and pedestrians as well. And on the next slide, these probably aren't the greatest pictures, but what you can see here is the 2 different heat maps for both pedestrians and cyclists. And if you look really closely, and it took us a little while to even notice this actually, but you can see on the Ordnance Survey mapping where the kind of 2 dedicated crossing points are. So it's pedestrians on the left or at the top there, and cyclists on just underneath. And you can actually get down to the kind of the level of detail that says, well, are pedestrians using the pedestrian bit and are cyclists using the cyclist bit? And you can see from kind of the analysis that we did, it showed that is the pattern that you'd expect. The vast majority of cyclists are better behaved than pedestrians. You can see there's more spill from pedestrians into the cycle lane than there are cyclists into the pedestrian lanes. Again, that's behavior you'd expect, and kind of the behavior you'd want. It's safer for it to be that way around, but you can really get down to that very granular level of detail that says, you know, is the infrastructure that I've put in being used? Is it being used as I expected? And has that scheme been a success? Obviously, this wasn't a scheme that we were able to do a before and after for, just because the scheme had already been put in place. But again, when you're comparing these kind of before and after, you can see that the different types of usage, how that can actually really be affected, by the infrastructure that you're putting in. And so again, this really is just a way of talking about how this level of data can better inform those decisions. It really feeds into everything that Tom was talking about here. It's really maybe just another layer down that says for very specific key schemes, how can I get better data that's focused on cyclists and pedestrians without having someone to sit there and kind of look through hours and hours of footage. Even if they had done that, they wouldn't be able to provide this kind of way of visualizing it, obviously, that kind of shows very clearly usage patterns and effectiveness of what's happened there. So yeah, in summary, what we were able to do with them was using their existing infrastructure. We provided them that more qualitative proof, not just empirical data or numerical data, but qualitative proof that said, this is actually the way that people move. This is that next level of detail. And we were able to do it with kind of 50% of the cost of what it would have cost them to do it manually. So the idea here is that really that is the opportunity for AI to come in and provide this enhanced data that is focused on the things that people really care about, that the government cares about, that the gear change is written about, and doing it in a more cost-effective, more efficient way. So really, what I wanted to do was just kind of introduce that as a concept and say that, you know, that data's out there. The system can do a whole bunch of different things, and obviously the kind of looking at different case studies can always be useful. So more than happy to answer questions or have specific follow-ups. But in terms of the presentation, that was what I wanted to introduce. So Simon, I will pass it back to you. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, John. That's incredible. And I think, I mean, it's certainly evident from the content, the potential of the AI software and the potential, and certainly, you know, I have first-hand experience with you and with Charlotte Collins and Active Norfolk as well of how this tool has been implemented and adapted in real time in the Norwich schemes. So I think for participants on this call, I guess if you've got specific questions that will relate to the tool and its application in the context of your work, then clearly have a think about that and pop those in the chat for the panel discussion. I'll just a reminder that we will be sort of controlling those questions and that discussion with Dave Stock. So your questions in the chat are really helpful so that we can ensure that your you know, any ideas you've got or questions can be fully addressed by the panel. John, thank you very much again. We're going to break now for 5 minutes just to give you all a chance to refresh, and we will then have Rob Holt from Sport England and Owen Redding, I think, as well, although he's not joined us just yet, I believe. But we will come back together at 18 minutes past and restart. Thank you.
Owen is here, Simon. I can see him on.
Oh, yeah, Brian, I don't think he'd have a problem with me saying that.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. And we will kick off now with Rob Holt from Sport England, a strategic planner at Sport England, and Owen Redding, who's an associate with David Locke Associates. And they will both provide us with an overview of the progress that's being made towards delivering the 3rd edition of Active Design. So Rob and Owen, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Simon, you've just stolen my first 3 points on the introduction on here, so thanks. If Owen wants to share his presentation, then I'll just introduce this session. So yeah, I'm Rob Holt from Sport England, strategic planner, as Simon says, and joined by Owen Redding from David Locke Associates, DLA, and we're going to give you a kind of quick run through of an update of where we've got to with the review of Active Design. So just to sort of take people or refresh people's minds, Active Design, the latest version was published back in 2015, so that's 7 years ago. And whilst we kind of think that 10 principles in Active Design are still felt to be relevant and useful, there's obviously been quite significant changes in planning and life since 2015. So we thought it was very timely, especially with Sport England's new Unite the Movement and the active environment big issue, that we should be looking back and reviewing, bringing up to date Active Design. We call it Active Design 2, the latest one for an Active Design 3. One of the key differences or elements is our partnership with OHID, Office of Health Improvement and Disparity, and also Active Travel England. So both those agencies and departments are coming in as partners with ourselves, which I think is really good. It brings health and also active travel within that. The Active Design 2 was done with PHE, Public Health England, previously, and so we're very keen to broaden the sort of the partnership with the guidance. So whilst it's been managed by Sport England, we do see those linkages across. So to do the review, we've commissioned David Locke Associates, who are currently doing the Active Design 3 review. And DLA are urban designers and master planners. You might have come across them. We're working on a range of large and small schemes, but principally they're sort of master planners and looking at the strategic design of new neighbourhoods. And they've also been involved in, well, they were the co-authors of the 2 other previous versions in 2007, 2015. So they're very, very wedded to the principles and where we're driving with active design and trying to get the built environment playing its part in getting people active through their everyday lives. So on that, I'll pass over to Owen from DLA, who will take you through where we've got to so far with the update. Owen.
Oh, hi, everybody. Can everyone see my screen okay? Is that sharing? I'm not used to Zoom.
Yes.
Brilliant. So my name is Owen Redding, as Rob said. I'm an associate urban designer at David Locke Associates. We're planners, master planners, urban designers. And this is just an update really on where we're at and the process we've been through and the process we're going through to update active design. This is really a refresh of the document, bringing it up to date, making sure that it reflects the current reality, but also can help policymakers and practitioners in a practical way, make sure it addresses their concerns. So Rob's pretty much covered this slide, to be honest. We are planners, master planners, urban designers. We've worked on active design for many years in all its iterations. We've also worked on planning for sport. We've worked with NHS Healthy New Towns. It's firmly embedded in all of our work, the principles and practice of active design. So overall, the aim of this project is to review the existing active design. What's good, what can be improved, what's changed in the regulatory and planning environment, but also what's changed in the world in terms of design practice, in terms of things we have to design for and we have to consider. And then looking to update the documents, looking at its content, looking at its usability, looking at how it's laid out, how it provides tools for different people to make things happen in the real world, and also to integrate our new partners, the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities, formerly part of Public Health England, so that's a continuity partner from the previous one, and Active Travel England, who many of you will know are a new agency. So we are working out the role of the different partners, making sure that it provides a useful document and an up-to-date document that you can talk to people about and help in policy assessment. We have been through, we are going through the project at the moment. We've been through 2 stages to date, a research stage, which is primarily a literature review, and a stakeholder engagement stage, which I'll go into in a bit more detail, which some of you were involved in. So we've been through a research stage, which was really a review of a great number of primary documents to understand what's changed since the previous active design, what's the new landscape, the planning system that we're working in, what role has design got in that, and what role does activity have in that. There were also a large number of supporting research studies that we looked through, which are going to really assist us when we're putting together the updated content and helping us to understand the quantitative and qualitative impact of some of the principles and suggested design actions. Really, the key findings from this was that planning to improve health and well-being through activity is still vitally important. There are a large number of councils and local authorities that, and this is just our research and Sport England's figures of local authorities there on the right, who've incorporated active design into their local plans and into their local policies. There will be more, but obviously it's not everywhere, but it's a good start. It's a good base to build on. But we want to make active design even more popular and even more part of the sort of bedrock of planning policy. I think one of the important things that came out of this research stage was that there's some new themes and directions that have jumped out in terms of the overall guidance around planning for activity health, but integrating that with other agendas and making sure that the work that is undertaken to create an active place also contributes and can work with other agendas, such as environmental sustainability, which is a very important agenda. And as most of you will know, there's a huge amount of crossover with creating active places, but it's vital to make that link in the guidance, because environmental sustainability is often a really hot political priority where activity may not be. Really fleshing out inclusive design and making and as well as making it a principle, but also demonstrating how to do it and the some of the considerations and some of the design tools and design processes that can be used to make that more part of daily design and creating active environments for all. Looking at creating activity in a non-residential context. I suppose this is a sort of legacy of active design's origination, which was a concern over sort of quality of particularly residential developments and their lack of their car-based and non-active nature. I think the agenda has moved on. I think there's still vital guidance needed for these developments, but there are lots of other places where activity needs to be integrated and considered in design: town centres, employment areas, places of temporary uses, flexible uses, and so that's another key theme for us to concentrate on. Innovations in active travel and transport. The field has moved on a long way since 2015 in terms of wayfinding, in terms of digital layer, in terms of the technology and the physical means of transport, but also the regulatory context and guidance out there. And then, as always, implementation and the tools and processes that can make this happen. And that has moved on a long way since 2015 in terms of the regulatory framework, in terms of the tools that government gives to local authorities and to others to make these interventions happen. And finally, another key finding was really having reviewed 47 documents and a load of research studies, that we concluded that there's a lot of guidance out there, and it's really important to stand out in a sea of guidance and making your guidance clear, concise, action focused, and innovative, I think was really important, but also considering how that guidance is delivered. Is it a PDF or is it something a bit different? And this is something we're sort of navigating our way through to find an output, and also to as part of a sort of basis for a wider program of outputs. Stage 2, which some of you will have been involved in, has been engagement. So we've been really going out quite widely across the sectors to try and understand a number of things. So we've been talking to what we called users, so people who use active design on a day-to-day basis. So an online questionnaire that went out that I imagine that most of you will have received a link to. We've had about 200, just over 200 responses now, which is great, from a wide variety of professions and people involved in creating activity in the built environment. And that's really helped us understand how people are using it, why people are using it, shortcomings, things that they consider really great about it. So that's been a really important tool for us. We also ran an in-person workshop with what we're calling shapers, so people who set guidance, and people who are leading in this field, and people who are at the sort of cutting edge of creating these active environments. And that was a really great session held a couple of months ago, and we got a lot of information out of that, which I'll go through. And finally, the sort of stage that we're at the moment, the owners, which is Sport England and the co-badging agencies, reviewing those outcomes and understanding what influence that has on updating active design. I'll run through some of the outputs that have come out of the stakeholder engagement stage. I think generally really positive, actually. People really like active design. They think it's most people felt that it was a useful tool, and they as you know, it's a great resource. But obviously we've been brought in to review it and improve it and make it the best possible tool. And there were a few things that quite a few people had not even heard of it. There was, as always, there's a lack of resource to implement it, or potentially use of other guidance, which had a lot of overlap with active design. There was a perception that because it was branded Sport England, some thought that it was just about sports, which obviously it's not. And generally, the active design is used for sort of policy development and advice, which I think is important to understand. The users questionnaire also picked out a number of areas that people felt would be useful to add. So really understanding benefits to wider agendas. I think this was a key theme that we will come back to over and over again when we're redrafting the guidance. How can we complement other areas within the built environment? So economic benefits jumped out. How can we essentially, how can we convince people that designing places to be active is worth it economically, but also in other areas of political and policy priority? So things like environmental sustainability. How do we hook activity in when it may not be the #1 concern of policymakers and politicians grappling with lots of different priorities? Lots of requests for more implementation examples, and how do you do it in this context and that context, and case studies, and going beyond just the sort of skin deep stuff, but how did it happen? How did you make it happen? And also the impact and importance of safety and perceptions of safety was really brought out in a number of responses. Shapers Workshop was a really good event. We had about 25 people along and covered 3 sort of areas, which was how do you use active design at the moment and improvements. How can we incorporate new best practice, and how can we update the content and the principles and make them even more relevant for today? And how can we and what best practice examples do you have? So I won't go through all of the findings. This is really sort of an update of where we're at, but really the sort of the feedback really matched actually the users questionnaire output, and was really interesting and really helpful that reinforced that. People were thought it was a great resource and it was a really useful bit of guidance, but that it needed and it's extremely robust. It's crazy, right? It's a robust bit of guidance, but can be a bit unwieldy. Potentially some of the principles have a bit of overlap, and it needs to be more concise, action oriented, and hook into things like economic factors and ROI to make it a way of convincing people that this is something that they need to prioritize. There's a lot of discussion of communication and promotion and how best to do that and how to get the word out. and lots of areas to add broadly, which were reassuringly matched the sort of questionnaire inputs. I will, in terms of the sort of the content and the guidance, I think where we're moving towards is I think the 10 principles are still sound, and I think you won't, they obviously give good guidance and good practice. I think the interesting thing is the how to address areas that are clearly have an overlap and clearly have political priority and policy priority behind them, and hooking activity into them and making sure that activity complements them, but without creating content creep and scope creep for active design, still making it really focused on activity, and making sure that it can provide succinct and clear advice that creates better places, more active places overall. So these again were the sort of the key areas that we are investigating, and how we add them in terms of expanded areas of guidance. There are some slides that we'll circulate. We'll circulate these slides. At the end of them, there's a bunch of sort of backup slides which give some of the sort of key findings that came out of the stakeholder engagement and the research stage in these different areas of guidance. So you're welcome to take a look through that. But this is where we're sort of concentrating on, and we're also looking, I think, in terms of how do we best demonstrate these in a bit of updated guidance and integrate them with the existing 10 principles. So sort of bringing it together, the overall direction of travel where we are at with an update of active design is looking at its really important, its usability and its length, and considering the audience and considering how it's used in practice, and the way it's worded, the way it's laid out, the way it's pitched. Looking at different agendas and looking at integrating the role of the economic factors of funding, and making sure that active design can complement all of these areas and can hook into different priorities. I think something that really came out in the workshop was looking at how places can be activated and promoted. So you can build the physical infrastructure, you can build the physical places, but what makes them active is sometimes what you do with those places and the programs built around it. And that's something that active design 2 certainly addresses with one of its principles, and whether we can integrate that and give a bit more guidance and more case studies on that, I think is important. And we're looking at really the sort of tools and examples and case studies that we're going to get into. And I think, example places and how different types of places have implemented active design, lots of case studies across different typologies of places, and illustrated examples. I think I think there's a clear need for both text guidance and policy guidance, but also design guidance and illustrated guidance to make this a really useful tool for everyone. And then underlying all of this, working with the team, we're looking at how do we promote this, how do we make it part of a sort of wider program, and how do we get hooks into national planning policy for active design. I mean, there's a number of agencies involved. It's an area of priority. How can we push it and make it part of that sort of bedrock of national planning policy, so that it's more widely recognised and you don't have to convince people of its worth, and that it's a vital resource. So last slide. Next steps on the project. We are currently in the sort of the drafting stage. We're working with Sport England, OHID, and Active Travel England on updating the structure, integrating the new research, and updating the overall guidance into the sort of the 10 principle structure, and what needs to be added, and case study examples. We'll be going out on case study visits, and these will primarily be guided by people involved in their creation, so that we can really get down and understand, down in detail and understand how they were created, and the compromises and the opportunities that were taken. Later in the year, towards the end of the year, I think we'll be putting out a sort of consultation on the draft guidance for review, and then publication of the guidance probably end of the year, early next year, start of next year potentially, depending on how the consultation process goes. So that's an update on where we're at. Hopefully we'll keep you updated at your upcoming meetings, and I would imagine a number of you will be involved in the consultation on the draft guidance. I'll hand back to Rob now, because I think I've taken up my 20 minutes, but I'm sure there'll be questions towards the end.
So yeah, and we've got some more slides, as Owen said, after this slide, which we can circulate, which gives a bit more flesh to the bones. I think a couple of sort of asks of this group is that we're very keen on showing where things work, showing where some of the principles are actually being delivered sort of in practice. So it's a kind of a sort of ask from this, is if people think of a really good, any good case studies, exemplars. It needn't be the whole lot of creating an active environment or whatever, but as a specific that you can say this is good connectivity, or this is created more activity. Let us know, and I would say I'm kind of looking at Dave. If Dave, could you be the sort of the collector from this group? If you go through Dave, and then Dave can send it through to myself, that would be great. It's often the case, sort of when we had the workshops, people saying, yeah, we need to show examples of this. And then when you said, have you got them? People say, well, if you can find a good one, then that would be good. So it is trying to find those good examples as well, because I do think it's not making the case, it's showing what works. I think that's a significant step forward. And the second bit is, yeah, we just starting redrafting now, looking at the structure and how we come together. And once we do get that draft consultation out, or the draft version, we'll definitely circulate it around. Again, I'll go through Dave in terms of this group, but we'll definitely circulate it on one of your sort of through your networks for comment. Which would be great towards the end of the year. I think we've taken a good slice of the 20 minutes there, and if not more. Sorry, Simon. That's it from us.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'm not going to waste any time. We're going to hand straight over to Dave. We've got about 15 minutes. We'll see how it goes with questions, but if we could just request, I think most people have cameras off, but we'll go to gallery view for the panel. So for those speakers, and then anyone else that's not directly involved, if you wouldn't mind, just cameras off, and we'll just focus with the panel. So over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And again, thank you ever so much, Tom, John, Owen, Rob. Great presentations. I know people on this call will be very grateful for the sort of richness in the content, lots of thought-provoking stuff there, folks. So thanks for that. I've done my best to try and collate and group and theme the questions. So I'll dot around, but the questions really are for all of the panel. Just to sort of start off with, and going back to the active travel piece and the things that Tom was suggesting around LCWIPs. There's a number of questions around how we link and bring together the walking, cycling for travel versus walking, cycling for health. So a number of people, Penny, Chris, and others are asking, is there evidence and is there a space for us to bring health data, things around obesity and deprivation, ITC, that sort of evidence into the selection process to prioritize cycling and walking infrastructure routes? So there's a question, I guess, for Tom more than anything else, but it's, do you see evidence or experience where we can begin to use some of those health indicators to shape the infrastructure priorities that local transport and other authorities might take when considering LCWIPs?
Yeah, definitely. has been used. I mentioned specifically obesity levels, but I can't remember which local authority focused in on those. I think they had their own data, but generally speaking, there is. I can send around a link. There is health data by area for the UK general health data, and some authorities, when they've got to the prioritization stage of their LCWIP and they've got their routes and they're scoring all of their routes to see how they fare against certain criteria. One of them could be what level of general health are the areas that the route passes through, and is it going to help enable those people to walk and cycle utility trips? Because I try not to see them as different things. Like, I think if you're walking or cycling to the shops instead of driving, that's building in moderate levels of exercise into your day. So I think that's walking and cycling for health as you do other things, and that's very much the Dutch approach. I'd also just say I haven't worked on it myself, but some of my colleagues have been involved in the social prescribing work that some of the authorities have been sort of working with GPs to prescribe cycling and getting involved in things like hire bike schemes. I can't talk too much about it because I haven't been involved, but there is other stuff going on in that area.
Thanks, Tom. I think there'll be a number of people on this call that are at various stages or engagement with LCWIPs. Some will be quite new, and others will be probably more into it. There was a question posted in the chat. I think Nick was sort of looking for, has anybody in the group been involved in LCWIPs? So thanks for Charlotte and Chris and others that have responded. So we'll perhaps hook you guys up. Well, one question I think that from things I put in the chat, Tom, is that the 6-stage process. It's probably an unfair question, but whose role and responsibility do you think it is to take ownership of that? And what's the advice really for active partnerships about getting involved, if not trying to sort of help lead that and bring stakeholders together? Because the process is very clear. Active partnerships will be very keen to be part of this and drive this. But in your experience, who's generally responsible for owning and funding and delivering that process?
Well, generally it is the local authority or the local authorities, like if you're working with a county and a district, for example. But a lot of the time it depends on budget and experience. I don't know if I can put her on the spot like this, but I think Charlotte might have more to say about involving active partnerships.
Well, you can put me on the spot. You have. Yeah, I mean, at Norfolk County, yeah, I've been kind of working with the highways sort of team. Yeah, it's a mixture of, like Tom says, county and sort of the districts, the local planning authorities. I think, yeah, I guess it depends on where your partnership is at. With Norfolk, it seems like they're really keen for us to be involved in things. I guess it's through some kind of joint funded roles that we've had with the county council, and that's helped our sort of relationship as well. They see the real value of it. I guess I've then become more involved principally because of some experience, but that was largely, we were in that position for my experience to be taken advantage of because of the relationship we had. So yeah, I'd definitely encourage building relationships with environment teams or planning teams, because it will open up doors to consideration of some of like the health indicators and such.
Charlotte, while you're on the panel, sorry, Scott, while you're on the panel, back to that question around the data that drives the infrastructure routes. What's your experience of where the travel patterns in highways that are driving the active travel and the transport route needs via the health data? Have you seen any evidence where those two things have either come into conflict or have been complementary to assist the design and planning of routes?
I mean, I'd say historically it's a bit sort of ad hoc, certainly with the LCWIP that's now happening. And again, I guess partly because I've been involved in the kind of the team, there's been a bit of an appetite and interest. So I've been approached to what kind of data could we feed into, and we've sort of allowed it to just the kind of process to flow through, and we've concluded that it will be something like kind of Tom suggested, that it will be something that's more at the prioritization stage. So we've got the data, we're looking at routes, we're looking at schemes, and then once we've got a long list, we can then use some of that health data to prioritize things to then sit within bids or to hopefully get implemented.
So it sounds as though for active partnerships, it's that early stage, it's that prioritization, it's influencing the direction of travel for it. So that's probably the advice to APs to get in at that stage. I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to move on. Gemma's asked a really interesting question around this. Can do an LCWIPs cover tackling pavement parking? I'm sure that's an issue for people, especially in urban areas. Quick response. I don't know, Tom, if you can address that.
Yeah.
Does it cover that thing?
Yeah, so when you go out and audit your walking routes, one thing you might notice is if there's footway parking, and you could either, when you come up with your list of infrastructure improvements for that particular route, you can say, well, we need to relocate, remove, change the design of that footway parking. So that's one way you can do it. Or if you have like an active travel strategy, I was saying you could, do a trial of your first school street. If you haven't done one before, do a trial of your of a modal filter. You could make that a sort of policy to focus on addressing footway parking and do that across the whole area as a sort of thing to do, almost to set the scene for some more drastic improvements. So that's two different approaches. The LCWIP will probably focus on a few particular routes, but you could also think about it in terms of like a strategic thing to do that will definitely benefit active travel wherever it's implemented.
Thanks, Tom. That's useful. I guess if we had more time, we could spend a lot more time on this. John, can I come to you just about a couple of things that have gone in? The software and the data from nGenius is phenomenal, and not something that I guess many of us have come across before. One question I think we have is, what's your advice? How do we encourage transport planners to understand, adopt, be receptive, engage with that level of data and use it as part of the modeling? I know it's early stages, but if you got any experience or reflections on, is the system ready for that level of data right now, and how do we get people to absorb it and take it on board and use it as part of modeling?
Yeah, that's a really brilliant question, and it's in my role as commercial director, it's all I focus on. So yeah, very, very relevant to thinking about how we can get people to adopt. I would say generally, actually, as a macro trend, the industry is going this way. This data will become commonplace in the next 3 to 5 years, and that's definitely giving a generous time frame. There are other solutions out there that are doing kind of similar types of analysis, not necessarily using infrastructure that's already in place. I mean, for us, that's one of the key reasons, that's one of the key things we do when we talk to authorities and trying to get people to use it. There's always that cost barrier. There's always an investment barrier for anything like this, which is why our focus is on using the infrastructure that's already there, using the cameras that are already there, and focus on delivering better results at a cost saving. That's always going to be true in local authorities. So that there's that element of it that I won't focus on too much here. I think in terms of adoption, being ready for the data, the gear change is a really important report for that reason. And I think that our initial conversations with Norfolk, with Coventry, with a number of other authorities that we've been speaking with, has really been focused on that need for better data. The DFT are going to start to mandate it, because the DFT know that a lot of bad decisions have been made. I mean, some of the pictures that Tom showed of those cycleways, for a bit of a laugh at the start of the presentation, are, you know, again, things that were in Gear Change Report, things that Norfolk were accused of, things that lots of authorities get accused of, and needing that better data is something that is going to start to become mandated, is certainly the movement in the market. And the idea is that people are getting this data from video already, they're just doing it manually. So the processes are in place, and really the challenge for us, or the role that startups and technology providers need to play, is make it easy to use. I would say that there's always more that can be done in terms of you know, centralizing a single way to capture data, or kind of mandating that through DFT, which is something they're always reluctant to do for various different reasons, some of them good, some of them bad. But absolutely, the market is moving towards there. What we've seen in Norfolk is an authority who are very, very keen. And we know other authorities are making investments in these technologies as well, with us and with others. So yeah, absolutely, I think we're going to see more and more of this increasingly.
Thanks, John. And a sort of final question on that. You've got active partnerships here and stakeholders all around the country. Are there any particular hotspots? My guess is that there's a number of active partnerships. This would have been the first time that they've come across you know, your product and this data and this way of going about things. Are there particular areas of the country that, I guess, not wanting to take a commercial angle, but you might be focusing on, that some active partnerships or colleagues here might go, do you know what, I'm going to pick up the phone to my transport team and just see what we're doing here?
Well, some of the places where this is working really well is actually, again, speaking to some of the stuff that Tom mentioned, is in some of the more rural counties. So Norfolk being a relatively large rural county, Leicestershire, Dorset as well have similar models where these guys have very large road networks, not just active travel focused, but in terms of general data, very large road networks that they have to constantly maintain, update, and collecting data across very wide areas is something that's difficult, obviously, when you're doing it manually. So one of the things that our approach allows you to do is kind of buy a single camera, 2 redeployable cameras, which you can go and put anywhere out on the network. They don't need to be connected. They can just record footage, and then you kind of upload the data, and you can have lots and lots of analysis across a really wide area at a kind of relatively low outlay. So places like Dorset, Leicestershire, Norfolk County Council are people we're kind of most advanced with and talking to about that type of model. So yeah, if there's active partnerships on who are associated with those authorities, that's the kind of data that we're talking about delivering to them.
Thanks, John. That's really useful. I think we will look to revisit it at some point, because it's clearly an emergent opportunity for us to influence you know, upper tier authorities around the whole active travel piece. So thank you very much for that. Just conscious of time, and just sort of moving across, because I want to ask one big panel question towards the end, but certainly active design, Rob, Owen, to what level of detail do you anticipate active design guidance going to? Because some of the questions that have come up in the past is that issue around the implementation gap. Not wanting to just labour the point, but there's lots of local authorities that will put it in at policy level, but we still find that the devil is in the detail, and that engagement between planning teams and developers around getting the principles identified. And sometimes at that level, there's sort of almost new technical guidance needed to be put on the table between planning teams and developers to get the principles implemented. Just wondering, and a couple of questions have come through, to what level of detail do you anticipate the guidance extending to help us deal with that that implementation gap sometimes?
Yeah, it's quite a difficult one when you're looking at broad principles to get embedded with the thinking of developing you know, neighbourhood design and what have you. So it can't, I should say, rather than it won't, it can't go down to that very micro level. But what it can do is, we've talked a lot about It's this balance with understanding, say we stick to 10 principles, people kind of understand the broad principles, and then the details within those, we're looking to signpost to other more technical details across the piece. So for instance, if we're looking at active travel solutions, we've been talking about connectivity and walking cycle networks, but active design really won't include the details in that. But what we can do then is signpost to ATE, who have got a raft of technical guidance and what have you. So it can be that signpost to more detailed guidance sort of outside the document. So I don't think we can have a single, you can't have active design of 10 principles and then and it's almost like a how-to guide to design the specific micro details of design. We'll never do that. But what the examples do though is you know, is the classic thing of actually seeing something in practice actually gives a lot more detail and shows where things have actually worked. So using examples, I think, can give you a lot of details without overburdening, without really drowning in details. Because I think that the active design, and this is coming back to a point that came up in the workshops, you know, it seems to be quite big. It's quite unwieldy. It's quite difficult to look at. But it's only a 10-principle, 100-page report when you break it down. But people are still finding, well, we need something more simple or more in a process, in a format that they can roll out, get the messages across simpler. So it's this balance between simply understood, but have enough detail and enough sort of links into the detail, using detail twice. So I think we're going to have to keep it at broad, but with linkages into more detail, and then take that off. And this is where the partnership with OHID and ATE is really important, because you broaden the base. It's not just Sport England, you know, coming in with very detailed design guide, which we might not be the best people to talk about. You know, how you design your cycle network is actually ATE and Sustrans and what have you, and they are the better ones. Sorry, that was a bit of a
no. I think what you outlined there, Rob, is that the active design guidance needs is a big influence around the policy element, and actually probably the principles are about, and this is where active partnerships can begin to support, is around what happens at a local design guide level, and what we hope is that the principles are taken to shape local design guides, and there's lots of good practice of that around the country. I've got I'm all right, Simon. I've got one more question. It's really for the whole panel, and looking at the whole active environment piece around cycling, walking infrastructure, green spaces, blue spaces. I'm just wondering whether what a lot of local active partnerships will probably come across are factors that work against the implementation of a wide range of active design principles, implementation and stuff on the ground, things like cost, things like housing density, things like standards. I'm just wondering if what the panel have got any advice about, for active partnerships being at a local level, how they begin to, what messages do they begin to put out to our planning and our local authority based colleagues to deal with the resistance that can come from here's good quality, here's good practice around green space, blue space, active travel, and all of those things. How do we deal with, any advice, how do we deal with the pressures that push against that, housing density, cost, sometimes behaviour standards, those sorts of things? Is that a fair question? It's there are things that are acting against what we're trying to do. I'm just wondering whether there's any thoughts on how we push back on those pressures that are resisting that.
I don't mind kicking off. It's something that's sort of come up with shared agendas. I think this is a point Owen made or flagged up, is activity and cost of living is another one. Cost of living crisis is suddenly top of political agendas. Sustainability, carbon reduction, global warming. There's lots of other competing priorities up there. Now, from active design, we kind of view it as that active design principles will probably always get knocked down the pecking order. But what we need to say is that for a local authority to reduce its carbon footprint on development, it can actually adopt a number of active design principles that will help them achieve that higher priority. So it's not actually saying you must do what we want ahead of other priorities. I think the clever way of looking at this, and this is something we'll be looking at in Active Design 3, is how we piggyback on other people's agendas, shared agendas. How can we say, if you want to, increase, if the sustainability one is, is great. If you want to reduce car use, then actually the principles that we're suggesting that will get people active will help you reduce car use, therefore carbon emissions. So I think it's having that smarter view of showing what we want to, looking at what we want to achieve and linking that into other people's agendas and priorities. And I think then you can say, well, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, then actually getting people out of the car and creating a cycle walking network in your neighbourhood, encouraging people to walk, not take the car, then actually that makes people do the 150 minutes activity a week. That's hitting our priorities, but actually that's reducing carbon emissions because there's less capital.
Joining up the agendas and sharing the priorities. Yeah, absolutely get that. Wonder if any of the other panel members from a sort of national perspective, what Rob's hinted on there, I think are sort of common interest principles, and whether there's an opportunity for, big national organisations to come together to coalesce around what are those common messages. Wonder if any of the other panel members see an opportunity and got any thoughts on that feeds into we want our built environment to be healthy and conducive to people being more active. Is there an opportunity for joint messaging?
I think definitely. I mean, I agree with everything Rob said. These agendas overlap, and another one, Rob mentioned cost, or Dave, you mentioned cost of living crisis. Cycling is kind of like saving me £8 a day on the train currently, cycling to work. So that's another thing which just ties in. I think having Brian here to talk about Active Travel England would have really been the best way of answering the question you just said, because that's what one of their roles is going to be, to bring everything together in this way and make the case and win arguments around why active travel should be at the top of agendas to solve these very real pressures we have.
Yeah, I mean, I'd make a small final comment, or final comment for me as well, that yeah, I completely agree. And I think for me, the only slightly different way of saying it is it's about perspectives. There will always be competing priorities, and we see it all the time with authorities who put schemes in because there's a political need to do it, or for whatever reason, and just understanding the perspectives of the other users and understanding what it is that they are trying to do, why they're trying to do it, trying to discover what it is they don't know about it. Those are the real things. So that's where everyone can where those how you can help the authorities and planners, as you kind of asked, is really perspectives. What is it that we're trying to achieve? What is it that we think is happening somewhere that we need to go and find out about that can stop this? Because they're not always going to be focused on the same priorities.
Thanks, John. I think that's a really cracking point to finish on. It is about that sort of priorities and that higher purpose, and how we bring these messages together so it impacts certainly at a corporate level. Simon, I'm just conscious of time. It's 10 past. We've still got 31 people on the call, but people may have to be elsewhere. I guess we should probably wrap up questions there.
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
just for me, personal thank you again to Rob, Owen, John, Tom, for some really interesting and great presentations, and I'm sure everybody's taken a lot from some of that today. Shall I pass back to you?
Thank you very much, and thanks again to the panel. Just to round off, and really just to ensure that this is available on the recording, the support requirement, or the support actions for the rest of this year and into next year. So the steering group have started to to create a program for 2023 as well. And we're clearly always open to ideas and to suggestions and how you'd wish this this network to continue to connect and learn. So our informal sessions are happening on the 12th of October and 9th of November. One of those, the session in October, we may extend slightly because we have a guest from Playing Out who's going to come, and Rosie from Playing Out is going to provide a little bit of an overview of their work and some case study examples. And then the next community of practice in December will be led by the Climate Change Steering Group, David Gent and his colleagues, and that will have an explicit climate change focus. So one to look forward to and look out for. And then we're already starting to work on the New Year's topic. So 1st of February is our current plan for a community of practice at the 1st of 2023, with a focus on play and women's safety and making space for girls. So we're still putting together the program on that, and would welcome any contributions from members of the members of the community. So we'll end there. I want to thank you again to all those who've contributed today, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Take care.